They waited for her to fail, certain that she didn't belong here. A woman, a professor, and worse, an African-American professor daring to step into the world of elite mathematical minds. But when Linda Cartwright solved a problem that even the geniuses from MIT and Harvard struggled with, the entire auditorium fell into stunned silence, and for the first time, those who had mocked her were forced to question everything they had believed. Today's class was different. A heavy silence filled the room as Professor Linda Cartwright entered. She was not a young professor, nor a newcomer. Linda Cartwright had taught at many prestigious universities, had made outstanding mathematical contributions, and had been regarded as an intellectual giant in her field. But this was her first time standing at the lectern of this institution, a place where she wasn't expected. Since Cartwright entered, sharp eyes had been following her every move, not out of curiosity, not out of respect, but with skepticism, with disdain. The students in this class were not like students in other classes. They were not the ones trying to climb up from the lowest rung to find opportunities. They were born at the top. Most of them were the children of esteemed families, destined to become leaders, scientists, or academic geniuses. They grew up in the best schools, taught by the most elite professors, and more importantly, no one had ever challenged them. And now, a black woman stood before them as their advanced mathematics professor. Ridiculous. Front row, Richard Whittaker. The guy sat there with an air of smugness, reclining in his chair, arms crossed. His cold blue eyes locked onto Cartwright, but there was no respect in them. He was the top student in his class, the son of a famous professor on the board of the school, the one all the other professors favored because they knew, one day, he would rise to a position of power like his father. He smirked, his gaze dripping with mockery. A black woman teaching advanced mathematics? They must be joking. His words went unchallenged. On the contrary, laughter erupted from the surrounding seats, shaking heads, eyes full of derision. None of them believed Cartwright had the capability to be there. None of them wanted to acknowledge her. They didn't have to do anything. They just needed to wait for Cartwright to embarrass herself. Cartwright heard it all, the mocking laughter, the impatient stares, as if they were just waiting to see her fail. But she didn't react. She simply walked quietly to the lectern, placed her briefcase on the table, and adjusted her glasses. For anyone else, this atmosphere would be a nightmare. But for Cartwright, it wasn't the first time. She was too familiar with these stares. She was too used to being underestimated before she even opened her mouth. And she knew exactly what to do. Whittaker crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and gave her an openly challenging look. "So, Professor, what are you going to teach us today?" Laughter bubbled up from his group of friends. Cartwright didn't respond. She simply picked up a piece of chalk, turned to the board, and wrote a series of complex equations, a system of high-level differential equations with overlapping Laplace transformations, the kind of problem that only the best could keep up with. The sharp strokes of the chalk sliced through the silence. When Cartwright set the chalk down, the lecture hall was once again silent. The once arrogant students looked up at the board, their expressions faltering. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected a black professor to be able to write out such a complex problem. But then Whittaker laughed. A cold, mocking laugh. "Interesting, but I have a question for you." He stood up, not to learn, not to absorb, but to attack. "Do you really understand what you just wrote?" Whispers filled the room. Cartwright's face didn't change, but in her eyes, there was a fire starting to burn. The game was on. The real battle had just begun. The lecture hall remained steeped in silence after Richard Whittaker's challenging question. No one moved, no one spoke. Yet there was a tension in the air, like a guitar string pulled taut, just waiting for the lightest touch to snap. The students sitting near Whitaker wore knowing smiles, as if they were eagerly anticipating a dramatic scene. Cartwright remained standing, unmoved, her gaze flickering briefly at the board before turning toward the young man standing in front of her. He slowly walked up, each step ringing clearly in the silent space. Not in a hurry, not with impatience, but with the confidence of someone who already knows the outcome. "Professor, if we're talking about Laplace transformations, I have a question for you." Whitaker's words were not just a question. His tone carried a calculated carefulness. He wasn't overtly aggressive, but it was clear enough for everyone around to understand that he did not consider Cartwright worthy of an answer. While Cartwright may have been accustomed to skeptical glances, Whitaker was accustomed to praise. He was a genius, or at least that's what everyone told him. He had been at the top of every math competition since he was a child, always surrounded by compliments, always recognized by famous professors in the field as the future of theoretical mathematics. For Whitaker, Cartwright could never be someone of the caliber to stand here. A professor from another school, without roots in prestigious research institutes like MIT or Harvard, not one of the names that the academic elite frequently mentioned. He didn't need to think much. There was only one possible explanation. This woman doesn't deserve it. And he would prove it right here, right now. Whitaker said nothing more. He turned, took a piece of chalk from the tray, and wrote a long equation on the board, so complex that the students in the back had to lean forward to see it clearly. The symbols appeared quickly, neatly, each mathematical notation stacked perfectly, as though he had memorized it in advance. A non-linear differential equation system, combined with Laplace and Fourier transforms. A problem that even some veteran professors would need hours to approach properly. Whispers started to ripple through the lecture hall. Some students smirked, others eagerly nodded, while some shot challenging glances at Cartwright, because they knew what was happening. This isn't a question, this is an attack. Whitaker set the chalk down, turned around, folded his arms across his chest, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Please, Professor." No one in the lecture hall expected Cartwright to solve the problem. They didn't believe in her intellect. They wanted to see her flustered, hesitant, surrounded by helplessness. They wanted to see her realize that she didn't belong here. Some were ready to laugh. Others had snarky remarks queued up in their minds, just waiting for the moment Cartwright made a mistake. But that moment never came. Cartwright didn't change her expression. She quietly walked to the board, glancing over the problem as if it were just a regular piece of text. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and 10 seconds. Then she took the piece of chalk. The class fell silent. Not because they expected her to solve it, but because they didn't expect her to be this confident. She began writing. No hesitation, no second thoughts, each stroke of the chalk neat, clear, and perfectly accurate. The first few strokes made some students frown. The next strokes silenced others entirely. The final lines left the whole lecture hall in stunned disbelief. It only took 3 minutes. Cartwright had solved the problem they thought no one could solve in an hour. Whitaker stood frozen. He couldn't believe his eyes. He tried to find a mistake, but every line on the board was perfect. Not just correct, but optimized better than any solution he had ever known. For the first time, some students exchanged skeptical glances. They had been so accustomed to dismissing Cartwright. But now a terrifying thought crept into their minds. Were we wrong? Cartwright set the chalk down and walked back to the desk, gazing directly at Whitaker. She didn't smile, didn't mock him, didn't need to say a word. Because the truth was already crystal clear. But she knew one thing: the battle was not over, and she knew that people like Whitaker wouldn't stop just because of one small failure. If he can't defeat me with this problem, he'll try again. Cartwright understood, and she was ready. Whitaker stood there, his hand clenched by his side, his cold blue eyes fixed intently on the board, where the words Cartwright had just written blazed like an undeniable insult. He couldn't believe what had just happened. In his whole life, he had never lost a battle of wits in the classroom, never encountered a professor he couldn't embarrass when he chose to, and certainly had never been defeated by someone like her. The students sitting around him could feel it too. No one was laughing anymore. No one whispered in mockery. They just sat there, some starting to glance at each other, others trying to find a logical explanation, but everyone clearly understood one thing. Cartwright was no ordinary professor. This only made it harder for Whitaker to accept. He inhaled deeply, as if trying to suppress the anger rising in his chest. To him, a math problem wasn't everything. To him, mathematics wasn't just numbers and equations, it was power. Whoever could control the most complex equations, whoever could solve the problems no one else could, that person would be at the top, recognized, celebrated, revered. And today, Cartwright had just entered his very domain. For Whitaker, this was no longer just a classroom debate. This was a war he could not lose. He squinted, curled his lip, but this time, the smile no longer held the same confidence as before. Instead, it was a bitter grin, hidden beneath a facade of calmness. "It's just luck," he said, his voice dropping. No longer arrogant, but still sharp and tense like a freshly sharpened knife. "If you're really that good, solve this problem." Without waiting another second, he turned around, grabbed the chalk, and wrote a new problem on the board. This time, he wasn't simply offering a tough problem. He wanted to destroy Cartwright right on the very stage she had just claimed. As the first strokes of chalk hit the board, the class immediately noticed the difference. This was no ordinary challenge anymore. This was a doctoral-level problem, a system of nonlinear differential equations with multiple variables, combined with Laplace and Fourier transforms, intertwined with probability theory and linear algebra. A problem that could take days to find a reasonable approach. He wrote quickly, forcefully, decisively. Each stroke of the chalk seemed to carve his anger into the board, as if he were reaffirming his power. Some of the students began to smile faintly. They looked at each other and nodded, as if they had just regained the balance of the universe. This time, it's different. This problem can't be solved quickly. Let's see what she does now. A few other students, although still shaken by Cartwright's first victory, couldn't believe she could continue to win. They expected her to hesitate. They expected her to falter. They expected her to fail, because the world they knew had never had room for a professor like her. When Whitaker put the chalk down, the atmosphere in the classroom grew heavy. He turned back to face Cartwright, his eyes filled with challenge, because he was sure that this time he had backed her into an inescapable corner. But Cartwright didn't rush. She simply stood there, calmly studying the problem, as if looking at a painting with no trace of worry or hesitation. "Do you think I'm afraid of this problem?" she said. She picked up the chalk, and for the next 10 minutes the classroom fell completely silent, witnessing a performance that no one could believe. Each stroke of chalk appeared on the board perfectly, each line of writing executed with absolute precision. Not just a correct solution, but an approach that surpassed anything they had imagined. Cartwright wasn't just solving the problem, she was teaching. Every transformation had a reason. Every step of the calculation was optimized. every mathematical symbol placed perfectly, with no unnecessary marks. When she finished writing the final line, the class remained still in silence. No one dared to speak. No one could deny what they had just witnessed. And Whitaker, the one who had set the problem, stood motionless, unable to say a word. He tried to find a mistake. He tried to find a flaw, but there was none. The solution was so perfect that no one could argue against it. This time, no one was smiling, because they had just witnessed the impossible happen for the second time. Whitaker's arrogance had been torn apart in the most brutal way, and that was just the beginning. The silence enveloped the classroom like a dense, heavy fog, thick with tension. No one spoke, not a whisper could be heard, and the mocking laughter from earlier had vanished. Everyone understood that this confrontation was far from over. It couldn't end with just a math problem, not while Whitaker still stood there with clenched fists and a cold, fiery gaze challenging everyone. He hadn't just lost once, but twice in a row, right in front of those he believed would always side with him, in the very lecture hall he had once controlled entirely. But Whitaker was not one to accept defeat easily. He couldn't let a black professor, someone he had never considered worthy, walk in and strip him of his position like this. He needed to regain control, and he needed to do it in a way that he was sure would end Cartwright once and for all. He lifted his head, trying to regain his confidence, and slowly stepped forward. His voice rang out in the silent space, sharp and calculated. "If you're really that good, would you dare compete in the national math competition?" Immediately, the lecture hall erupted. Gasps echoed everywhere. Some students were wide-eyed, others whispered amongst themselves, but all shared the same thought. This was no longer just a classroom confrontation. This was war. Unlike the math problems on the board, the national math competition was not something anyone could just join. It was not just a test, but a battleground where the greatest minds from MIT, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford competed, and only the best could survive until the end. More importantly, it was a place where one small mistake could ruin a reputation. Cartwright knew this was a trap. Whitaker thought that if he couldn't defeat her in the classroom, he would push her into a place he was certain she wouldn't survive. A battleground where the rules of the academic elite were strictly enforced, and no matter how talented a black professor like her was, she would never be accepted as a winner. Eyes filled with expectation turned toward Cartwright, waiting to see if she would take the bait. Some students were still stunned by what they had just witnessed, but they couldn't believe she could perform the same way on a higher-level field. Because this wasn't just a math problem anymore. This was a system that would fight against her. But Cartwright only smiled lightly. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no worry. She looked directly at Whitaker, her gaze calm yet deep, as if she had already seen through everything. "I'll participate." Her words rang out, simple yet powerful, like thunder that shattered the still air. The lecture hall erupted. Some students couldn't believe what they had just heard. Others turned to whisper, confused and excited. Did she really accept? No way, this is the national math competition. Does she really think she can win? The gossip spread, but one person stood still amidst it all. Whitaker. He froze. He hadn't thought she would agree. He thought she would refuse, or at least hesitate, try to avoid it. But no, she agreed immediately, without a shred of doubt, without fear. An invisible anger surged within him, but he kept his composure. "Fine," he said, his voice still dripping with sarcasm, but this time tinged with a hint of reluctance. "Then let's see if you really belong in this world." Whitaker's loyal followers nodded. Some chuckled, Others patted each other's backs as if they had just secured the outcome for Cartwright. But deep down, even they couldn't be sure anymore. Because Cartwright had proven that she was not an easy opponent to defeat, and this time she had accepted a battle no one thought she could win. The class ended, but its aftermath lingered for days. News of Cartwright joining the national math competition spread across the campus like wildfire. No one could believe that a professor would dare to step into a battlefield reserved only for the best students, those who had dedicated their lives to preparing for this moment. Even less could they believe that she would challenge minds recognized as geniuses from the most prestigious universities in the country. In the library, in the cafes, along the long hallways wherever students gathered, lively debates erupted over the upcoming competition. Who does she think she is, that she can beat the best in the country? Sure, Whitaker might not have beaten her in the classroom, but this competition is a whole different thing. You never know. If she can embarrass Whitaker right in front of us, who's to say she can't do the same in the competition? This isn't just about who's smarter. There, she'll be up against an entire system. Meanwhile, in a secluded corner of the main building, Whitaker stood with his loyal group of students, his eyes sharp as a knife as he gazed out into the distance. "We can't let her win," he said, his voice low and cold. "We'll make sure she never walks out of this competition as a winner." A thin smile spread across his face. "I'll make sure of that personally." The real battle had only just begun. The news of the showdown between Whitaker and Cartwright spread not only within the classroom, but throughout the entire campus, like a storm. From the long hallways of the mathematics department, through the vast library where the brightest students tirelessly study, to the crowded coffee shop where the most passionate discussions take place, there was no place where the name Cartwright wasn't mentioned. Stories about her turned into gossip, speculation, and half-doubting, half-contemptuous remarks. Some called her crazy, others saw her as a bizarre phenomenon, but most just viewed her as an arrogant person who didn't know her place. Does she really think she has a chance at the national math competition? Whitaker may be arrogant, but he's never lost any competition. A black professor, not from MIT or Harvard, daring to challenge genius minds? It's a joke. Voices mixed with skepticism and sarcasm echoed everywhere. For many, the national math competition wasn't just an intellectual challenge, but a test to determine who truly belonged to the elite and who didn't. And from their perspective, Cartwright didn't belong there. Not only students, but even some senior professors subtly shook their heads when they heard she was participating in the competition. They had seen Cartwright surpass Whitaker in his own classroom, but that had been a personal confrontation. Taking it to the next level, an arena where geniuses who had been trained for years competed, was something entirely different. "She's gone too far." Those words weren't just a comment, but an unspoken affirmation that Cartwright shouldn't have ventured into a battle she couldn't win. But Cartwright didn't care. She didn't need anyone to believe in her. She just needed to prove the truth. Meanwhile, Whitaker wasn't just standing idly by, waiting for the outcome of the contest. He knew that Cartwright couldn't defeat him if everything was set up according to his plan. He spent the entire night in the library, not studying math, but crafting a perfect plan to ensure Cartwright would never have a chance to shine in this competition. He wasn't just a smart student. He was the son of a professor with great influence in the National Math Competition Council, and power always finds ways to bend fairness to its will. "We won't let her win," he said to his closest friends. "I'll make sure she never walks out of this competition as the winner." His loyal followers nodded in agreement. For them, this battle was no longer just between Cartwright and Whitaker. It had become a war between an outsider and a system that had existed for centuries, and they would do anything to protect it. The waves began to roar. Cartwright knew she wasn't just fighting Whitaker. She was up against an entire system, a system built to protect people like him, a system that never wanted to see someone like her break through the invisible barriers it had put in place. But she wasn't afraid. She wasn't in this competition to prove anything to them. She was in it for herself. She was in it because the truth didn't need anyone's permission. She was in it because this wasn't just the fight of one individual. It was a fight against a misconception that had existed for far too long. She knew the storm was rising, and she was ready to face it. Cartwright knew that this time, she was not just facing a regular problem or an ordinary exam. She was facing a much greater challenge, an entire system that didn't want her to succeed. Her confrontation with Whitaker was only the surface of a much deeper battle, one where power, status, and deeply ingrained prejudices had taken root in the very foundations of elite academia. If she truly wanted to overcome it, she had to prepare like a warrior about to step into a life-or-death battle. She did not allow herself a moment of distraction. Every day, she spent hours in the library, immersing herself in advanced mathematical texts, studying problems from international math competitions, complex problems that even the sharpest minds would need days to solve. But she didn't just want to solve them. She wanted to understand them, to peel back each layer of logic within, to make them a part of her mind so that when she stepped into the exam, nothing could shake her resolve. She wasn't merely reviewing, she was honing her strategic thinking, studying creative approaches, techniques that only the most experienced could master. When other students had gone home after a long day, when the lights in the lecture halls had flickered off, Cartwright remained, under the dim yellow light of the library, silently writing equations, mathematical symbols on the paper before her. No one witnessed her persistence, but she didn't need anyone to. She would not allow herself to make mistakes. She would not give herself the chance to doubt herself, because she knew, out there were those doing everything to make her fail. Meanwhile, Whitaker was not just waiting for the competition. He knew that to ensure his victory, he could not rely solely on his own abilities. He didn't need to be better than Cartwright. He just needed to ensure she had no chance of winning. Whitaker was not just good at math. He came from a powerful family. His father was one of the most influential professors on the National Math Competition Board, and he knew well how people like him could manipulate the system to bend the rules in their favor. He didn't need to cheat, didn't need to do anything too obvious to draw attention. He just needed to create invisible barriers that Cartwright would be unable to overcome. He and his team secretly began gathering information on Cartwright, from her academic history to the research papers she had published. But when they couldn't find anything to discredit her professionally, he decided to go further. He started contacting some of the examiners on the competition board, people who could apply pressure on Cartwright during the exam without anyone noticing. "We don't need to play dirty," he said with a sly smile as he spoke to one of the professors on the board. "We just need to make her understand that this competition isn't meant for her." Some examiners might not be swayed, but Whitaker didn't need all of them. He just needed one or two to agree to set problems that were far beyond the normal difficulty, or create rules that would disadvantage Cartwright, or simply apply enough mental pressure to make her slip up. A small change in the regulations, a slight reduction in the time limit, or more stringent supervision, legitimate, but enough to throw her off balance. He knew Cartwright could be brilliant, but she wasn't a machine. He knew she had weaknesses, and he would find them. Cartwright didn't know the schemes being plotted behind her back, but she could feel the pressure growing stronger. The students who had once followed her clash with Whitaker now avoided bringing it up in her presence, as if they didn't want to get involved in a fight they believed she would lose. Some looked at her with curiosity, while others openly showed contempt. Does she really think she can beat Whitaker? She'll probably withdraw before the exam even starts. This competition isn't for people like her. She heard it all, but as always, she didn't react. She simply continued with her work, because she knew that the real challenge was not just in the problems. It was in whether she could maintain her belief in herself in a world that didn't want to accept her. She knew the storm was coming, and she was ready to face it. As the exam day approached, the atmosphere at the school grew increasingly tense. Whitaker remained utterly confident, while Cartwright continued working with unshakable patience. No one knew what would happen during the exam, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just a battle about mathematics. This was a battle about psychology, about power, and about recognition. And when this battle began, only one person would stand tall at the end. The day of the exam has arrived. MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, all the most prestigious universities have representatives here, the finest mathematical minds in the country. Individuals who have spent their entire lives preparing for moments like this. The grand hall of the National Mathematics Competition is filled with tense energy, where hundreds are getting ready to engage in the most intense intellectual battle. There is no room for weakness, no room for dreamers. Only mathematics, and only the best will survive until the end. As Cartwright enters the hall, the space seems to freeze for a few seconds. Eyes immediately turn toward her. No one needs to say a word, for doubt and disdain are clearly visible on every face. In the front row, Whitaker leans back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He doesn't need to say anything. Everyone here has thought the same as him the moment Cartwright stepped in. Time to watch her fail. Students from Ivy League schools exchange knowing glances quietly. In their eyes, Cartwright is not a competitor. She's an outsider, a mistake, a pointless challenge to a system that has existed for centuries. But Cartwright doesn't care. She doesn't look at their eyes. She only looks at the question paper before her. The real battle has begun. The hall falls into a tense silence as the judges step onto the stage. An elderly professor, representing the scientific council, stands in the spotlight, his voice booming. Welcome to the first round of the National Mathematics Competition. Today, we will discover who truly deserves to be among the greatest mathematical minds. There are no friendly greetings, no polite encouragements. This is not an ordinary exam. This is a battlefield. A beep rings out as the clock begins counting down. On the large screen, the first problem appears. A series of complex equations sprawls across the screen, combining multivariable integrals, matrix algebra, and statistical probability. The numbers overlap, the mathematical symbols clutter the board, a problem that only the brightest minds could grasp in a short time. The sound of scribbling fills the air as the contestants begin writing. Some blink a few times, trying to absorb the data, while others start solving immediately, their pens gliding across the page like musicians playing a familiar tune. Cartwright looks at the problem. She isn't in a hurry. While other contestants have already started writing, she sits still, her eyes focused solely on the problem before her, as though she's silently peeling away its layers. In the front row, Whitaker glances at her, his lips curling into another smirk. She's overwhelmed, but he doesn't know that Cartwright is not overwhelmed. She's analyzing the problem in a way no one else in the hall can. All around the hall, eyes continue to watch Cartwright with curiosity and skepticism. Some of the students have heard of her before, about her clash with Whitaker in university lectures, but they still can't believe she's actually daring to step in here. A professor is participating in this exam? Strange. Who does she think she is, competing with the best students in the country? She's probably just showing off. None of them really believe Cartwright can win. Some even hope she makes a mistake, as it would confirm that the world still operates according to its proper order. The outsiders can never surpass the invisible barriers already set in place. 3 minutes pass. 5 minutes. Cartwright still hasn't written a word, but in her mind, everything is already clear. This problem is not as hard as it seems. It's designed to disrupt thinking, to make people waste time following the wrong paths before realizing the hidden simplicity beneath. She picks up her pen. The first lines appear on the page. Not trivial calculations, not hesitant steps. She writes down the final solution first, as if she already had the answer in her head all along. Her pen moves steadily, never hesitating. The symbols appear with absolute precision, each transformation executed perfectly, as though she already knew exactly what to do. And then, less than 10 minutes later, she sets the pen down. The other contestants are still engrossed in their calculations, some crossing things out, others checking each step they've taken. But Cartwright is done. Whitaker sees it. The confidence in his eyes vanishes in the blink of an eye. He tightens his grip on the pen in his hand. It's impossible. But it's the truth. Cartwright not only finished the problem first, but she also did so with a calmness that is almost frightening. And that can only mean one thing. She knows she's right. The atmosphere in the hall becomes more tense than ever. Some contestants begin to realize what's happening. Some turn to look at her, while others stop just to check if they're witnessing something unbelievable right in front of them. In the air, a ripple of unease starts to spread. How can she be so fast? Has she really finished already? It's impossible, right? Whispers begin to rise. Whitaker still wears a smile, but it's tight, forced. He can't believe this is happening. And he knows this is just the first problem. Cartwright didn't enter this battlefield to participate. She entered to win. The entire hall was still immersed in a tense atmosphere as the first round of the competition truly began. The contestants, the brightest minds from the most prestigious universities in the United States, dove into the exam with astonishing speed. They were accustomed to such pressures, trained to handle complex problems within a limited time. But today, something different was happening, something none of them had expected. Advanced differential equations, Fourier series, Laplace transforms, all appeared on the exam, leaving no room for hesitation or confusion. Everyone had to make use of every second, as this competition was not only testing intelligence but also challenging one's ability to withstand pressure and solve problems quickly. In the front row, Whitaker operated like a machine. His hand moved swiftly across the paper, each line of calculation appearing accurately, without a moment's hesitation. Every equation was formed in his mind as if he had seen the solution before he even picked up his pen. He didn't just want to pass the exam. He wanted to crush anyone who dared to challenge him, especially Cartwright. But there was one thing Whitaker couldn't anticipate. Cartwright was no slouch. She didn't dive into the exam at the frantic pace like the others. Instead, Cartwright skimmed through all the questions, scanning each problem as though she were observing a battle from above, analyzing the entire picture before making her move. When she started writing, what appeared on the paper was not just a correct answer, but an optimal solution. She skipped the unnecessary steps, eliminated redundant calculations, and simplified each part with such precision that it was almost unbelievable. The lines on her paper not only showed her understanding of mathematics, but also a rare finesse, a sharp strategic thinking that not everyone possessed. Within just the first 15 minutes, Cartwright had taken the lead. Those sitting near her began to glance over, some contestants who had been confident in their abilities, casually peeking at her paper as though they needed to confirm they weren't imagining things. What is she doing? No way. How could she be that fast? Is she making a mistake? The glances toward Cartwright shifted from disdain and mockery to something else, a subconscious apprehension. From the judges section, the senior professors of the competition council began exchanging looks. They hadn't expected this. Cartwright had not only maintained her position, but she was now in the lead. That not only surprised them, it made them uncomfortable. "What is she doing?" one judge whispered. "Impossible. This is just the first round. Maybe she's just lucky." Another shook his head, but there was a noticeable tremor in his voice. The judges had seen many exceptional contestants before, but they had never seen a professor, a person who should be on the judging side, not competing, performing the way Cartwright was right now. And that made them uneasy. Whitaker tried to stay calm, continuing to focus on his own exam. But it wasn't easy. He was used to being the best. Always the leader, the one everyone admired, the one no one could surpass. But now, for the first time, he felt his position truly threatened. He wrote faster. Too fast. And then he unconsciously made a mistake. A number was wrong. A parenthesis was misplaced. An unnecessary transformation step. He had to stop, erase, rewrite, check. That had never happened to him before. He glanced at Cartwright. She was still writing at a steady pace, no hint of hesitation, not a single moment of doubt. Anger surged within him. He couldn't accept this. Even though Cartwright was ahead, that didn't mean the judge's bias had changed. Some judges began to feel uncomfortable seeing her perform better than expected. They couldn't deny she was doing well, but they didn't want to accept that she could be better than their elite students. One judge, sitting in the upper row, furrowed his brow and quietly spoke to a colleague beside him. "It's time to up the difficulty level." And that's exactly what they did. The first round wasn't over yet, but the next problems would be unlike any before. They were going to take things to the next level, a level they believed would be enough to break Cartwright. Cartwright felt the change in the atmosphere. She knew she was going against an entire system and they wouldn't let her win easily. But she wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back. If they wanted to push her to the limit, she would show them that she had no limit. The atmosphere in the hall became tense after the first round ended. The weaker contestants had been eliminated, leaving only half of the original participants to move on to the next round. The remaining contestants were not just skilled. They were the strongest, the brightest mathematical minds America had ever trained. But even with geniuses from MIT, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford still present, one unexpected name remained standing: Linda Cartwright. Her presence was no longer a joke. Earlier, they had thought she would be eliminated in the first round, that she was just a curious professor trying to compete with a group of brilliant students, but ultimately unable to keep up with their pace. But now, she wasn't just holding her own, she was on par with the best. Some of the eliminated contestants still sat in the audience, watching the next round unfold with incredulity. They had once been the geniuses in their own world, but now they were mere bystanders. Some were still stunned by their early exit, while others were bitter. But perhaps the strangest feeling came from seeing someone they had once underestimated now sitting at the same table as Whitaker, still fighting. Whitaker could not accept this. He had won many competitions in his life. He was used to always being the best in any exam room he entered. But today, he felt something for the first time: threat. Not because the problem was too hard, not because of the pressure, but because next to him, Cartwright was still sitting there, matching his speed. He clenched his jaw, trying to control his breath to maintain his composure. But it wasn't easy. He had never imagined he would have to truly compete with a professor, someone he believed didn't belong there. The bell signaling the start of round 2 rang. The large electronic scoreboard above the hall flickered, and immediately the problems for this round appeared on the screen. If the first round had been difficult, round 2 was an entirely different level. No longer were their problems solvable with standard formulas. The problems now were real challenges, combining applied mathematics, advanced calculus, abstract algebra, and mathematical concepts not even taught in any college program. The remaining contestants froze for a moment. Even Whitaker had to take a few seconds to grasp the problem. But Cartwright had no reaction. She just looked at the problem, as if she had seen it before, as if she were not surprised. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. This time, Whitaker could no longer ignore her. After the first 10 minutes of round 2, the harsh filtering began. Some contestants started sweating, not because the problem was too hard, but because they realized they were wasting too much time just trying to understand the structure of the problem before even finding a solution. Some began to fidget, glancing around to check the progress of others. They were used to being the smartest in the room, but now they weren't so sure. Cartwright wasted no time. Every line that appeared on her paper was sharp and precise. No unnecessary calculations. The way she approached the problem was unlike anyone else in the hall. Other contestants were getting caught up in lengthy transformations, trying to figure out the optimal approach, but Cartwright had seen the shortest path the moment she read the problem, and that made those around her feel uneasy. A student from MIT, a contestant once considered a strong contender for first place, had to stop writing, leaning back in his seat, his eyes wide in disbelief as he stared at Cartwright. Another student from Princeton started writing faster, but his handwriting became disorganized, as if he were trying to catch up with her speed but couldn't. Those who had once believed they were the strongest now began to wonder if they really were. Whitaker was still writing. He had a clear strategy from the start. He knew this round wasn't just about mathematics, it was also a test of speed and endurance. He believed Cartwright couldn't keep up for long, but when he looked up, he saw she was still writing. No sign of fatigue, no sign of panic, no sign of someone about to collapse. And that was when, for the first time in his life, Whitaker felt fear. On the judge's bench, some exchanged worried glances. They hadn't expected this. She shouldn't have made it this far. If she keeps this up, what will happen? They knew they had to do something. They couldn't let her win. The next round would no longer be just about mathematics. They would push her to her limits, and they believed that this time she wouldn't be able to hold on. Cartwright knew they were trying to eliminate her. She knew they wouldn't let her win easily. But she also knew one thing more important than anything else. They could change the rules of the game, but they couldn't change the truth. And the truth was, she was leading. The final problem appeared on the large screen, with mathematical symbols stretching out like an endless maze, a nonlinear differential equation filled with complex variables that defied any recognizable pattern. No one in the auditorium could immediately grasp the direction of the problem. Even the geniuses of this generation had to take time to understand it. The atmosphere grew heavy as each second passed. The faint sound of pens on paper had disappeared, and the confident nods from earlier rounds were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to come to a halt, immersed in confusion. Some contestants furrowed their brows as they looked at the problem, their eyes filled with doubt, as if wondering whether this was an error made by the judges. Others tried to cling to what they knew, But the deeper they dug, the more they realized that there was no clear path through this problem. Whitaker, though maintaining a calm expression, knew deep down that this was no ordinary challenge. He had never encountered this problem before. He had never seen anything like it in international math competitions or any materials he had studied. If there was a solution, it was certainly not something he had learned. He had to find his own way, to forge a path no one had ever thought of. The judges, sitting high above, observed everything. Some smiled faintly, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. They hadn't chosen this problem randomly. They knew no one could solve it in the allotted time. They knew that if anyone failed, that person would have no chance to correct their mistake. This wasn't just a mathematical challenge. It was a psychological one. A test to see who truly deserved to win and who would crumble under the pressure of an unsolvable problem with little time left. Some contestants began to feel desperate. Some set their pens down. Others shook their heads. No one wanted to be the first to give up, but they couldn't pretend they could keep going. A sense of helplessness began to spread through the auditorium like an undercurrent that no one could stop. But amid this suffocating atmosphere, Cartwright sat silently, observing the problem as if it were not an insurmountable obstacle. She didn't seem stunned, didn't frown, and showed no signs of panic. On the contrary, there was something in her eyes that unsettled those sitting closest to her. A quiet confidence, a subtle smile as if she had seen something no one else had noticed. She picked up her pen, the tip touching the blank page. No one spoke, but everyone was watching her. A few students furrowed their brows, wondering what she was doing. Others whispered to one another, trying to figure out whether she was serious or just pretending to be strong. But no matter what they thought, the reality remained unchanged. She was the first to start writing. Whitaker felt a sense of discomfort rising in his chest. He knew he needed to begin, but for the first time in his life, he felt an invisible pressure weighing down on him, a sensation he had never experienced in any previous competition. He couldn't let her get ahead. He couldn't let her dominate the game. He took a deep breath, trying to push all other thoughts out of his mind, then bent down and started to write. The judges, still watching from above, were no longer as indifferent as before. Some began to exchange quick words with each other. Others bent down to check the contestant list, as if they were trying to confirm something they themselves did not want to believe. Lines appeared on Cartwright's paper, with no crossings out, no signs of hesitation. The other contestants, still struggling with the problem, began to realize this. Some glanced toward her, trying to figure out what she was doing. 10 minutes passed, and Cartwright continued writing. Her calculations became clearer, each step executed with perfect precision. Some people began to feel a sense of panic, because they knew what this meant. She wasn't just solving the problem, she was solving it correctly. Whitaker wrote faster, but he knew he was losing control. His heart raced, not from the pressure of the problem, but because he sensed something he didn't want to admit. She might actually win. A judge stood up, walked over to Cartwright and picked up her paper. Other professors approached, some frowning, others widening their eyes at the calculations before them. No one said a word, but the silence was louder than any sound. One of the judges shook his head slightly, his voice ringing out, though not loudly enough to disturb the quiet, but clear enough for all to hear. "She's right." Those words were like a bomb exploding in the auditorium. Some contestants looked up, some opened their mouths to say something, but couldn't utter a word. Whitaker stared at the judge, his eyes darkening. No one could believe what had just happened. Cartwright had solved the problem, and she was right. The judge placed her paper on the table and turned to look at his colleagues, their faces showing something akin to panic, as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Some students began to clap, initially hesitantly, but the applause soon spread throughout the room. Those who had mocked her, who had looked down on her, now had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. She had won. Whitaker sat motionless, his eyes hollow. He couldn't accept it. The judges on stage remained standing, some bowing their heads, some shaking their heads silently. They knew everything had changed. No one could deny what had just happened. Cartwright hadn't just won. She had shattered everything they had ever believed. The auditorium fell into a terrifying silence, a silence not born of respect, but of absolute astonishment. Cartwright sat there, her back still straight, her hand gently laying the pen down on the table. Not a hint of hesitation, no sign of tension, no rapid breaths showing that she had just completed the most difficult problem of the competition. She simply finished her task. The writing on her paper was not just a solution, it was a declaration. The mathematical symbols were arranged perfectly, with no strike-throughs, no sign of confusion. Everything was precise, sharp, and flawless to the point of being almost unbelievable. Each transformation, each calculation was written with a speed and accuracy that no other contestant could match. The judges on stage could no longer maintain their previous calm. Some leaned forward, trying to read her work faster, their eyes filled with alertness. One placed a hand on his chin, another stared at the paper as if trying to find the smallest mistake. But the longer they looked, the more they realized the terrible truth. There was no mistake. Whitaker looked over, and for the first time in his life, he felt fear. He had never seen anyone do this before. A problem that even he struggled to fully understand the structure of, a problem designed to defeat all contestants. And yet Cartwright solved it at an unimaginable speed. He gripped his pen tightly, his knuckles white from the tension. He looked down at his own paper, then over to hers. He hadn't finished. She had. And that wasn't the only thing that terrified him. She didn't just finish before everyone else. She completed it with an eerie calmness. He tried to reassure himself. Maybe she did it quickly, but speed wasn't always the most important thing. If she made even a tiny mistake, just one error in the process of transforming the equation, everything would fall apart. He had to believe that. He needed to believe that no one could truly do this. But then, he heard the voice from the panel of judges. She's right. The words hit him like a hammer to the mind. The auditorium buzzed with whispers. Some contestants turned to look at each other, the skepticism in their eyes slowly turning to astonishment. They couldn't believe that the problem could actually be solved in such a short time. Another judge stepped down, taking Cartwright's paper and quickly scanning each calculation. He blinked several times, then turned to his colleagues, his voice unable to hide his surprise. Not only correct, but the most concise solution. Those words extinguished all doubt. No one could argue anymore. Cartwright hadn't just solved the problem, she had done it in a way that no one else could match. Some students looked down at their own papers, knowing they no longer stood a chance against her. Others quietly put their pens down, no need to wait for the results, because they knew the battle was over. Whitaker still couldn't believe what had just happened. He wanted to find a flaw, some detail to refute her victory, but deep down, he knew there was nothing to refute, because Cartwright had won, and no one could change that. The judges on stage seemed to sense that something was shifting. They knew this result wasn't just a victory for one person. It was a challenge to the entire system they had long defended. Cartwright remained seated, not proud, not showing any smugness. She simply observed her surroundings, as if waiting for a reaction from those who had once looked down on her. Some professors in the judging panel appeared uncomfortable. One shook his head slightly, another bit his lip, as though trying to accept a truth they never thought would happen. Whitaker said nothing. He couldn't. Because in this moment he had lost everything. Cartwright hadn't just defeated him in a competition. She had shattered every belief he once held. He had spent his entire life believing that people like her could never match him. He had believed that the world had a certain order, a system in which he was the ruler. But now, that system had collapsed. No one in the auditorium could deny this any longer. Linda Cartwright, the woman they had once dismissed, the one they thought had no place in this competition, had emerged as the true genius. And whether they liked it or not, they would have to remember her name forever. The silence stretched out like a deep cut into the atmosphere, tense to the point that no one dared to breathe too loudly. The judge held Cartwright's paper in his hand, his gaze fixed on each line of calculations, reading once, then reading again, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The entire hall froze in time. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. On the faces of the remaining contestants, from the brightest students of MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford to Whitaker, everyone wore the same expression: shock, disbelief, and a quiet fear. Then, the moment no one expected happened. The judge looked up, eyes wide, his voice rang out, sharp as a knife, cutting through the last remaining illusion. "We have a winner." No one moved. Not a sound was heard. The heavy moments passed like centuries, and then, finally, the name of the winner rang out, clear and undeniable. Linda Cartwright. The sound spread like a wave, crashing into every corner of the hall, shattering all doubt, erasing all the prejudices that had long existed within the walls of this educational system. At first, no one reacted. Some students stared wide-eyed, some had their mouths open, and some looked at each other as if waiting for someone to say it was all just a joke. But then, as the truth sank in, different reactions began to show. Some contestants lowered their heads, faces flushed with shame, unable to believe that the person they had once mocked had just surpassed everyone to become the best. Others, the smarter ones, began to feel an invisible fear because they knew that this moment would not just change the contest, but the very system they had trusted. On the judges' panel, a few looked like they'd just been struck hard in the face. The professors who had once taken pride in Whitaker, who had believed that only students from prestigious schools could win, now had to face a reality they could not deny. One judge cleared his throat as if to say something, but fell silent when he saw the eyes of his colleagues. There was nothing to say, nothing to justify, nothing to argue against. Linda Cartwright had won. And they knew that this moment would change history. Whitaker couldn't move. He sat there, hands clenched on the desk, eyes fixed on his paper, but the numbers before him were now just meaningless characters. He had lost. But the scariest thing was not that he had lost. He had lost to someone he had once looked down on. He had believed that this contest was just a formality to reaffirm his place, to prove once again that he was the best, that the world worked the way he wanted it to. But Cartwright had shattered all those beliefs. He lifted his head, his eyes met Cartwright's, and in that moment he realized she wasn't looking at him with mockery or arrogance. No, it was worse than that. She didn't care about him. His presence meant nothing to her. She didn't need to belittle him to prove her worth. She had let the truth speak for itself, and that was what truly defeated him. On the judges' panel, an older professor lowered his head, muttering something no one could hear. Another tapped his fingers lightly on the table, his face showing no emotion, but his eyes could not hide his confusion. They had spent their lives teaching the brightest students, believing that some people were just born superior to others. They had believed their system was unshakable, that only the chosen could reach the top. But Cartwright had proven them wrong. They couldn't reject this result, they couldn't hide the truth, and that truth would change everything. At first, only one person clapped, then another, then another. The applause spread, slowly but surely, like a small wave growing into a powerful storm. The students who had once belittled Cartwright were now applauding her, not just because she had won, but because she had done what no one thought was possible. Whitaker still sat there, unmoving, not participating in the praise. The professors on stage looked at each other, some still trying to hold on to their last shred of dignity, but they knew they couldn't stop this. Cartwright had stepped into the light and no one could extinguish that light. She sat there, still calm, still not smug. She just observed, her eyes reflecting the image of a hall slowly changing. A world starting to shake the walls that had existed for so long. She had not only won a contest, she had defeated an entire system, and whether those who had once opposed her wanted to or not, they would have to remember her name forever. The applause erupted like thunder, spreading throughout the hall, sweeping away those who had initially hesitated, pulling along those who had doubted, forcing even the most stubborn to face reality. The truth could not be denied. Linda Cartwright had won. At first, only a few clapped, but then, like a chain reaction, the entire hall stood up. The students who had mocked her, who had spoken words of derision, now had no choice but to applaud. Some bowed their heads in shame, while others looked at her with genuine admiration. Cartwright sat there, as calm as ever, but in her eyes burned a fire of persistence, of unyielding willpower that had burned through all the walls that had held her back for so long. She didn't need to appear proud. Her victory spoke for itself. In the front row, Whitaker could hardly believe his eyes. He sat motionless, his hands tightly clenched on the desk, his lips pressed together so hard they turned pale. He had witnessed many victories in his life, but he had never seen a victory so ruthless. Not because Cartwright had humiliated him, not because she had deliberately made him look foolish, but because she didn't need to. He looked at Cartwright. She looked at him. No words were spoken, but he understood. She didn't need to say anything because the truth had won. That was what hurt him the most. If she had mocked him, if she had used arrogance to crush him, perhaps he would have had an excuse to resist. But no, Cartwright had simply proven what he had never wanted to admit, that she was better than him, that she deserved to be here, that the prejudices he had clung to for so long had been crushed by her. In the judges' row, the professors who once held absolute power over the competition now faced an earthquake. They had once thought they could control the outcome, once believed that no matter what, the final victory would belong to the familiar faces, the students from prestigious families, those who had been nurtured in elite environments from a young age, those whom the system always favored. But Linda Cartwright had shattered all of that. An older professor sat quietly, his eyes fixed on Cartwright's solution, as if trying to find a loophole, a mistake, a weakness to latch onto. But he found nothing. Another judge, who had been so self-satisfied earlier, now could only bite his lip, knowing that there was no way to dismiss this victory. Another tried to speak but then realized there was nothing to say. They had lost, not just in a competition. They had lost to a truth they did not want to accept. Among the crowd, the students who had once ridiculed Cartwright stood there, looking like those who had just had all their beliefs stripped away. They had once believed that a professor like Cartwright could never defeat their genius minds. They believed there were boundaries that could not be broken, that only people like Whitaker had the right to stand at the top. But now they were forced to face a brutal reality. Everything they had believed was wrong. Some students approached Cartwright, their eyes still filled with hesitation but also full of respect. One awkwardly spoke up, "Professor, I was wrong about you." Cartwright simply nodded, without reproach, without sarcasm. She didn't need them to apologize, because her victory was the clearest answer. Whitaker still couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept that he, the one lauded as a genius, the one the entire math department had placed their hopes in, had been defeated so irrefutably. He didn't want to look at Cartwright, but his eyes kept being drawn to her, as if he needed to witness the truth he didn't want to believe. Then, something that made him even more furious happened. Some professors, those who had once sided with him, who had seen him as the epitome of excellence, began to move toward Cartwright. They nodded at her. Some even extended their hands, as if they were finally admitting what they had fought against for so long. He saw those professors praising her, asking her about her solution, expressing admiration that they had never shown before, and he knew that he was no longer the center of this world. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the hall without saying a word. No one called him back. No one paid attention to him anymore, because they had a new person to look toward. Cartwright looked around the hall, not arrogantly, not smugly. She didn't need anyone to acknowledge her, but now everyone had acknowledged her. A student from Princeton approached, his voice filled with respect. "You're not just the best in this competition. You might be the best I've ever seen." Cartwright smiled, but her gaze was sharp, as though she was looking beyond this moment. She knew that today's victory wasn't just about a competition. This was a turning point, a moment that made an entire system tremble. A declaration that intellect knows no limits, no race, no boundary can restrain it. And whether those who had once looked down on her accepted it or not, they would have to remember her forever. The next morning, the atmosphere in the lecture hall was no longer the same. The whispers of mockery had faded, the skeptical glances disappeared, and the arrogant challenge from the front row was gone. The students who had once looked down on Cartwright now sat quietly, their eyes focused on the podium with a respect they never thought they would offer to this woman. Cartwright entered the classroom as though nothing had happened. She had not changed, but the world around her had. There were no more sneering smiles, no more haughty challenges. Instead, the students now sat upright, ready to listen, because they knew that this woman deserved their attention. Cartwright did not look at them with a sense of victory, nor was there any arrogance in her demeanor. As she stood before the board, there was only one thing she wanted to do: teach. She took a piece of chalk and slowly wrote a new problem on the board. Not to prove anything, not to defeat anyone, simply to teach. And this time, no one doubted her. Whitaker was not present in the class that morning. No one knew where he was, but no one asked about him anymore. He had once been the one who could not be challenged, the one everyone believed would always be the best. But when Cartwright stepped onto the podium of triumph, his world had collapsed. He had once believed that the prejudices he was raised with were true, that people like him were born to lead, while people like Cartwright would never have a place in such prestigious spaces. But she had proved him wrong, and he couldn't accept that. Cartwright not only changed the perspective of the students, but she also shook the judges in the front row. The professors who had once looked at her with disdain now had to face a painful truth. They were wrong. Wrong to think that excellence only belonged to a certain group of people. Wrong to believe that a system full of prejudice could forever obscure the truth. They might not say it aloud, but they knew they could no longer ignore talents like Cartwright. And that frightened them, because if she could break down that wall, how many others could do the same? Cartwright never entered that competition to boast or put anyone down. She never sought fame, never needed anyone's recognition. But because she didn't need it, she won it. Her victory was not just a personal triumph. It was a declaration that intelligence has no color, is not bound by status, and is not limited by the prejudices people try to impose on it. A declaration that everyone deserves to be judged by their actual abilities, not by circumstances they cannot control. A declaration that the truth, no matter how long buried, will always find a way to shine. And whether people like Whitaker accept it or not, they would remember her name forever. Cartwright set the chalk down and turned to face the class. Today, we will continue the lecture as usual. She didn't need to remind them of her victory, because it was already engraved in the minds of everyone present. A hand slowly rose. This was the first time in this class that a student voluntarily asked a question. "Professor, could you explain this transformation step again?" Cartwright smiled. "Sure." And so the lesson began. No more skeptical looks, no more mocking laughter, no more invisible boundaries separating people who should be standing on equal ground. Only knowledge, respect, and a lesson that everyone would remember. Linda Cartwright did not enter the competition to prove she was better than anyone else. She simply wanted to prove that intelligence has no boundaries, no color, and is not limited by the prejudices society imposes. But because she didn't seek recognition, she earned it. Not only from the students who once looked down on her, but also from those who held power in the academic world. Her battle was not only fought in one auditorium, but it was a larger battle, the battle against the invisible barriers that had existed for generations. And she won not just because of her intelligence, but because she dared to stand up, dared to face, dared to challenge a system that seemed impossible to change. So, what about you? If you were Cartwright, if you knew you had to face the deepest prejudices, would you dare to step up and fight, or would you step back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.